Good afternoon from Rome and good morning, good evening to all of you. Thanks for joining us for this gLOCAL event. I'm very happy to welcome you all, and while others are joining us, I'll just start. We're already a couple of minutes late. So my name is Renata Mirulla. I am the facilitator of EvalForward, a community of practice on evaluation for agriculture, food security and rural development. I have the pleasure to welcome you to this gLOCAL event, the first gLOCAL event that we are organizing this week, building forward better on food security using evidence for a post-COVID world without hunger. This event is organized jointly with the evaluation offices of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the World Food Programme. Building forward better is the main theme of this year gLOCAL Evaluation Week, a week that, as you may know, is dedicated to raising awareness on monitoring and evaluation and on the use and the value of monitoring and evaluation. So we need evidence to build back better and build forward better, as the title of our event today, and respond to the impacts that COVID has produced in our societies. And this is the theme of today's session. Let me walk you through the agenda of today's event. We will have opening remarks by Andrea Cook, Director of Evaluation of WFP. Then we will have a presentation on the evidence summary on COVID-19 and food security, recently published by the UN Evaluation Group at the UNEC. And this presentation will be delivered by Patrick Breard, the main author of this evidence summary. Then we will have a moderated panel discussion. The discussion will be moderated by Carlos Tarazona, Senior Evaluation Officer at FAO. And we have some distinguished guests with us today. Sarah Lawton, Chief of Social Protection of WFP, Patrick Jacquerson, Program and Results Team Leader at the Office of Emergencies and Resilience at FAO, and Joan Carling, Indigenous human rights activist and environmentalist from the Philippines. We will have also time for questions, answers, and comments, so stay with us. And don't hesitate to use the chat to post your questions or your comments. Our support team will make sure that we don't miss any of your inputs, or raising your hand also will be possible, and speaking up when the time comes for the questions and the discussions. Last but not least, this session is being recorded, and we will follow up with all of you with session notes, with the recording, and with the presentations that will be delivered today. But now let me hand over to Andrea Cook for her opening remarks. Andrea is the Director of Evaluation at WFP, and she provides leadership for WFP evaluation function globally. She is also currently co-chairing Eval Partners and serving in many advisory groups and scientific panels for research and evaluation initiatives at global level. Andrea, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues and friends. It's a real pleasure to be among you today, albeit virtually. COVID-19 has not only endangered our health, but it threatens our livelihoods, economic development, the stability of societies, and our hopes for a better future. Even before the pandemic struck, progress towards achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda has been slow. Today, there's growing evidence that many of the 169 targets that world leaders set 5.5 years ago will be difficult to reach. Food insecurity in particular is on the rise. and it's jeopardizing our ambition for zero hunger by 2030. In 2019, nearly 690 million people suffered from hunger. And in 2020, that number has been growing up to an estimated 130 million, by an extra 130 million. In the global response to the pandemic, I've been struck by two trends that offer us a ray of light. Firstly, there's this sense of solidarity within and across nations to combat a common challenge. The pandemic has helped to bring expression to the now familiar term of leaving no one behind. And indeed, no one is safe until everyone is safe. The current debates around access to vaccines at the moment are a very real articulation of this challenge. Secondly, there's been an emerging collective understanding that the road to recovery must be focused on science and evidence. We are indeed witnessing scientists addressing parliaments and ministers acting increasingly on evidence and data to drive their decision making. And it's in this context that evaluation has an essential role to play in producing the evidence that will help light a path for our leaders and decision makers to not only build back better after COVID, but to steer a truer course towards the achievement of SDG 2 and all the other SDGs. Evaluation will become increasingly relevant in this decade of action as we look to see what works and what doesn't, as we learn from our mistakes and we learn how to champion our successes, so that we work more effectively in partnership so that we can scale up local approaches globally and global approaches locally. To that end, the timely creation of evidence summaries, syntheses, rapid reviews and lesson learned papers around thematic, system-wide, SDG-related and context-specific areas will be particularly helpful for decision makers as they seek to drive change. The summary of evidence that we will present today is a prime example of how the evaluation community is working to answer the call to act rapidly and to join forces to deliver evidence that is strategically relevant and useful. Its findings will be of particular relevance to the United Nations Food Systems Summit, which will take place in September, with a pre-summit in Rome in July. And the summit has the aim to shape sustainable food systems of the future. So I'd really like to congratulate the evaluation officers of the Rome-based agencies, FAO, IFAD, and WFP, who together with UNIDO had the foresight to initiate and work together to deliver this very timely publication. Special thanks go to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland for supporting the project. And with this, I would like to hand over to our presenter today, Patrick. Thank you.
Patrick?
Thank you so much, Renata, and thank you, Andrea, for this inspiring introduction. So I'm Patrick Brouillard, and I'm the consultant who worked with the management team on the development of this evidence summary. So I'm going to walk you through a few slides. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see the slides? Renata, can you see the slides?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So this evidence summary, and actually I should say rapid evidence summary, because the bulk of the work was completed between October and December last year. Was triggered by the context that Andrea has recalled, almost 690 million people undernourished in 2019, and the COVID crisis adding up to 100 million people to that number in 2020. And simultaneously, well, there is evidence on what works to support food security in time of crisis. So in April 2020, the UN published the UN framework for the immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19 that presented 5 pillars around which to articulate a response. And the intent was to leverage these pillars to develop a summary of the evidence from past evaluations about what works and what eventually doesn't work to address food security in times of crisis. So as Andrea has indicated, this is a joint work produced by FAO, IFAD, UNIDO, and the WFP with the intent to make evaluative evidence easier to access and use. So we built on the 5 pillars of the UN framework and selected 3 areas, three areas on which to focus the research. The first research question is what interventions were effective or less effective in supporting social protection and basic services to preserve food security during crisis. The second pillar and research question was on economic response and recovery. And the third pillar was on which interventions have better supported social cohesion and helped vulnerable population groups become more resilient to food insecurity. So our approach and methodology, well, we did some desk research and also contacted a number of UN agencies and IFI and bilateral donors to identify evaluation reports that could be selected for this study. We identified altogether more than 250 resources, and we used the selection matrix. So we adapted a matrix that was provided by WFP, and we selected altogether 65 evaluation reports that had covered assessments of interventions that aim to respond to or mitigate the effect of a crisis and on food security. So the report, geographic coverage of the report was primarily Africa, followed by Asia and the Pacific. Several reports also had a global coverage. I mean, these were, for instance, evaluation of institutional evaluations or corporate evaluations. As for the types of crises that were covered in the 65 evaluation reports, about 1/3 of the reports focused on conflict and insecurity. Close to 30% also of the evaluation reports covered the extreme weather, and about slightly over 10% of the reports covered the health shocks. For example, the response to the Ebola crisis. So in terms of findings, on the first pillar, social protection and basic services. So the key finding was that social protection and basic services are more effective when provided in an integrated manner. So cash, we explored several modalities that formed these interventions. So as for cash transfers, we found that they are the preferred modality most often, but they can be challenging to implement and monitor. They require some enabling factors such as functioning markets or technical capacities. As for food assistance, I mean, this implies significant logistical efforts, but it can be implemented respecting social distancing, meaning that, for instance, food assistance was found an effective modality in the Ebola crisis, for instance, which was relevant, obviously, in a period of lockdown and social distancing that we have faced with the COVID. School feeding programs can be an important support to the youth, although it does not always target the most vulnerable. I mean, the targeting of the most vulnerable in the school feeding programs has improved, but there's always a risk of including youth who are not among the most vulnerable, or to exclude conversely vulnerable children in some communities. And input distribution requires timely implementation and to be complemented with capacity development and financial services. Timely implementation comes from the fact that a number of evaluation reports found that the distribution of inputs had come after the planting season. I mean, primarily due to the crisis, obviously, but that was obviously a factor affecting the effectiveness of the modality. So the second pillar and second research question that we worked on regards economic response and recovery. So this intervention shows that economic response and the recovery must account for multifaceted contextual factors. That there were some cross-cutting findings across the evaluation reports, showing that cross-sectoral diagnosis, like needs assessment for different types of target beneficiaries, are key for designing relevant interventions. However, I mean, so a number of evaluation reports find that this is complex to organize, as agencies have often a sectoral approach, and therefore, I mean, there's a need frequently to strengthen preparedness. Another cross-cutting finding was that the remote data collection tools can cope with situations where staff movement is restricted or that require social distancing, but need to mitigate the risk to exclude vulnerable target groups, meaning that remote data collection with technologies, for instance, a risk to sometimes to exclude the elders or people with disabilities, so that needs to be accounted for in the design of these interventions. Still on economic response and recovery, so we explored a number of modalities of intervention. And one of the key findings that economic recovery interventions benefit from clear scaling up strategies. The first modality that we explored, the food supply chains, can promote economic recovery when involving the private sector and addressing marketing, rural finance, behavioral change, and infrastructure. So these components are important in order to have effective interventions that aim to re-establish food supply chains. The second modality that we explored brought the finding that legislative and regulatory frameworks are more effectively improved when policy-oriented interventions are embedded in existing policy-making processes and leverage resource partnerships. And this main finding comes from the fact that a number of policy-oriented interventions were not necessarily embedded in the national policy-making processes. So that was one of the findings of this evaluation reports. Another finding is that in some countries where there's a stronger decentralization and devolution of the policy and administrative processes, contributing to policy making a request to be, let's say, present and active for these agencies at different levels, which is not necessarily always designed from the onset in some of the interventions. So to be present at national level, but also at regional level, at different levels of policy making. The third finding was that programs that support rural employment and entrepreneurship are effective for certain groups of poor and vulnerable populations, such as the youth, but require long-term multi-sectoral commitment and effort to produce lasting change. In fact, many evaluation reports find that these interventions are effective in terms of building capacities, but they also indicate that the long-term sustainability and employability of the target beneficiaries need to be supported by follow-up interventions or projects. And the third component, third pillar, was social cohesion and resilience. So we found that development intervention can contribute to social cohesion and more resilient communities by including social dialogue and conflict resolution mechanisms, by avoiding limited scope and focus on the small target groups, and by including CSOs in the design and implementation of intervention. So maybe one word on the social dialogue and conflict resolution mechanisms. A number of evaluation reports also stress the importance to work with the local leaders of the communities during the design and implementation of the interventions. And also maybe a word on the including CSOs. Actually, 1/3 of the reports had interventions that included the CSOs in their design and implementation, but many other evaluation reports made reference to CSOs also. However, they were making reference to CSOs by indicating that they should be more involved, or that sometimes the national context is not extremely supportive of their involvement, but the intervention, the projects should make all the efforts to involve the CSOs in these interventions. So the overall conclusion, so on the first pillar, social protection interventions, so they are more effective when designed as a bundle of complementary modalities tailored to the local context and specific needs of target beneficiaries and involve adequate partnerships. The second conclusion on economic response and recovery programs, they are more effective when designed and implemented, taking into account systemic dimensions, economic, financial, infrastructural, political, and environmental and social, and including clear scaling up strategies with involvement of partners, private sector, and political actors. And the final conclusion on social cohesion interventions, they are more effective when broadening the scope to include not only the core target beneficiaries, but also the most vulnerable. So that was in a nutshell the findings and conclusions of this study that I warmly, of course, invite you to review, which is online, and also, I mean, gLOCAL and Renata have circulated a brief that provides further information that I invite you to warmly to consult. So. So thank you very much. Renata, it's up to you. Back to you.
Yes, thank you, Patrick, for presenting us the main messages from the study. As you also recalled, we also distributed a brief which summarizes the findings of this evidence summary. And we will recirculate also to all of you after the event. I'd like to propose you, before handing over to Carlos and to the panel discussion, a quick poll. As Patrick and Andrea have highlighted the role of evidence, especially in responding to the COVID pandemic. I'd like Angelo to bring up the poll and ask you to, in your context, in your experience, to what extent is the response to the impact of COVID-19 on food security being informed by evidence? So by evaluation evidence or other types of evidence? Do you think evidence is being used more than in past crises?
When the show debuted, episodes
same or somewhat, or not being used at all, or you don't know? Please vote in the poll so we have an idea, and then Angelo, when you're ready, you can display the results. Okay, so in between response, evidence is being somewhat used. So, okay, that's an average response, but I leave it now to pass the floor to Carlos, for Carlos Tarazona, Senior Evaluation Officer, who will introduce the panel discussion. Over to you, Carlos.
Yes, thank you, Renata, and good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Very, very interesting, the results of the poll. And I think my takeaway of the poll is that almost more than 18% don't know, and only 5% say that evidence has not been used. This is, I think, very interesting. So it means that quite a few of the participants to today's events have something to share from their angle, from their point of view, about how evidence has been used in the organizations or in their own countries' response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm pleased today to be with you, and I would like to, in this event, I would like to introduce you some distinguished panelists that will be discussing with us, sharing with us their experience on how their organization, in their own context, COVID-19 has been having an influence on food security, and how they have been responding to this. And we have with us today Ms. Joan Carlin, who is an indigenous human rights activist and environmentalist from the Philippines. We also have Ms. Sarah Lafton, who is the Chief of Social Protection at WFP, at the World Food Program. And last but not least, also Mr. Patrick Jackson is with us. He is the Program and Resource Team Leader of the Office of Emergencies and Resilience in FAO. So we would like our panelists to discuss a few questions that this evidence summary raised vis-a-vis the response of agencies like FAO and WFP to the pandemic. No? For example, we would like to hear from them how evidence has informed or shaped the response to COVID-19 of their agencies, or in the case of our colleague from the Philippines, I mean, how she perceived that evidence had been used, had shaped the response in their community. Then we wanted also to hear from them, I mean, what actions have been taken by the agencies or to measure or to monitor the impact of the response on food security. And last but not least, also which lessons have been learned in this response since the organizations in which our colleagues work have been supporting countries in mitigating the effects of COVID-19 on food security. So let me invite our colleague from our colleagues from the panelists to start this discussion. And let me ask Ms. Joan Carling maybe to start with this with her views.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. Let me just say that I would be coming from the perspective of indigenous peoples and would like to say that the evidence that has come out from the studies is something very much also related and captured some of the realities in relation to the response of indigenous peoples, not to COVID. I would like to highlight this finding in the report that says the findings that social protection were more effective when designed and tailored to local context and needs of target beneficiaries. It very much capture what many indigenous communities are demanding in relation to appropriate response to make it more inclusive in based on their circumstances. So, for example, communities that are relatively self-sufficient on their food, that they have enough food production and supply, would prefer receiving cash so that they can buy the health protection facilities or support, like for example buying masks, alcohol or soap, because they don't have the cash to pay for those things that will also protect them health-wise. In the case, for example, of those that were displaced, those coming from urban centers or cities that have to go back to their communities, they prefer to receive agricultural tools so that they can farm in their communities and produce their own food. Some of them, of course, prefer cash transfer because that they don't have other livelihood sources to pay their food. So I'm just citing these are the kind of responses that are tailored fit to the circumstances of indigenous peoples in different parts. Now, the other one is also what has been mentioned, the issue of support to food distribution and preservation. And these are for indigenous peoples and small farmers whose main livelihood are the production of food. And they need support for the marketing of their products, like transportation and market. And I've seen this from the region where I come from, where a big part of indigenous peoples are producing vegetables for the market. But because of the lockdown and the lack of transport and lack of facilities for preservation, they were put to waste. Some were already, of course, donated, but then the producers themselves suffer, because they cannot buy already their other needs. Although, of course, they still have food security, but that's also the point in the evidence that we need to look at the integrated link, of the issue of food security with the issue of livelihood, with the issue of health, with the issue of access to markets, and also, of course, the issue of sustainability of the food production, especially in times of this COVID.
Thank you very much, Joa. Thank you for sharing that experience. Sarah, would you like to comment on these questions and the experience in WFP?
Yeah, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Thanks a lot, Carlos and Renata, for the invitation. Yeah, so I mean, certainly in terms the findings in the summary of evaluation evidence that Patrick presented are, consistent with our own experience, that any intervention is going to produce a greater impact on food security when they're not designed as standalone interventions. They're integrated, as needed with other programs or basic services. when they do meet context-specific needs. And in short, basically, when we see kind of what agencies are doing in a bigger picture of, within a bigger picture of what countries and other partners are doing as well. But then to come to your specific question, Carlos, which is how did evidence shape the WFP's response to COVID? Maybe I'd like to just talk about a couple of different ways that evidence shaped our response to COVID. And maybe I'll say something about how it shaped our programmatic response, basically how we use data to inform the scale and the focus of WFP's response to COVID. And then I could say a few words about how evidence supported sort of the organizational side, the organization to be actually ready to support and carry out this COVID response. So at the programmatic level, I think probably people on the call on this webinar know, but in case you don't, you know, food security analysis is a cornerstone of what WFP does. And that analysis provides us and the governments we're supporting and the partners we're working with the essential information that we would need in any situation to identify populations in need and target the most appropriate type of assistance and scale of interventions. And generally, it gives us the knowledge that we need to inform policy decisions and support governments in making those decisions and to support advocacy. So we have lots of different well-established data collection methodologies in place, from food security and vulnerability assessments to market and essential needs assessments and market assessments and a variety of food security monitoring tools. And we used all of these mechanisms during the COVID response. So basically what happened when COVID came is that there was a real need to work with other agencies like those on this call to provide a projection about what the impact, the impact was going to be on food security. And I don't think any of us really had any experience in doing a projection of an event that was happening really at a global scale, especially because the impact of that event was so evolving and it was so different. And over time, we saw that really a lot. It was so different in different parts of the world. But using the data that was available, we developed an analytical model to make these projections. And that model established what sort of a baseline figure of acute food insecurity was. And then it drew on ILO data to identify likely job losses and income losses related to that. And it drew on World Bank data to identify what the likely remittance losses were going to be, because obviously that's a huge part of GDP in many countries. And that's where we got this figure of 130 million additional people who would be acutely food insecure as a result of COVID. And of course, that was based, as I'm saying, on a number of different assumptions, but it was that figure and that process, that data-driven process, that really shaped what became a massive response effort. So, I mean, WFP alone last year reached 115 million people, which is a total record in the history of the organization. And that sort of understanding of a crisis at that scale also supported or was the basis for all the support that was also provided to the broader health and humanitarian response. And of course, over time, more and more disaggregated data on the impact of COVID on people, helped WFP and every agency to adapt our programmatic response to meet needs where it was clear that those were coming, for example, in urban areas. And at the beginning, probably none of the agencies on the call we were all probably more active in rural areas than in urban areas, but then it became clear that urban areas were going to be especially hard hit. So that was another way we use data to draw on that. So just on the organizational side, again, long experience in emergency response with WFP, and that's been so much evaluated over time. There's so many evaluations of specific emergency responses or corporate emergency responses to pandemics like Ebola, and strategic evaluations and lessons learned and so on. So a way WFP drew on that at an organizational level was, I think we knew what would be required to roll out and sustain and support a response to a global crisis like this, to protect business continuity and to support a scale up and so on. So a few examples of things that we did, for instance, from all of these evaluations, it was clear that kind of keeping your workforce going was going to be really key. So WFP, changed some of its HR rules as a result of COVID, where people didn't have to go on break in service, or people who were supposed to be separated didn't get separated if they didn't want to go, or if they couldn't go home. There were, hundreds and hundreds, 500 people, I think, redeployed from Rome to country offices. There were various different ways that staff were supported. Basically, a set of HR moves that were all designed to keep people employed and to keep things moving. And similarly, based on past experience, coordination is key. So this was a corporate emergency, the first global corporate emergency involving even, everywhere in the world. So daily coordination mechanisms were put in place. And the third that I thought was really interesting was mechanisms were put in place to limit the bureaucracy, so that bureaucratic demands, so that country offices could just focus on getting their work done. So all of us at HQ, when we wanted something from a country office, we had to go through a gatekeeper. We basically had to get permission to ask the country office to send us, to answer our questions or send us materials, and all that was designed to protect the country office's ability to do its job. And I think just the very last thing I want to say is just a third thing, because that of course was really at the beginning, but then a lot of data started to come about not just the health impact of the pandemic, but its socioeconomic impact, and beyond that, about the extent and the scope of national responses. So, we and other agencies were, doing what we know how to do and implementing large-scale emergency response, but it very soon became clear that what governments were doing to support their own people through this pandemic, that was at a scale that completely dwarfed, what we were doing. And that added a really important strategic perspective to WFP's work, and obviously to the whole UN's work as well. And that's where that UN response framework to the socioeconomic impact of COVID came from. And WFP, we had our own sort of medium-term programmatic framework that drew on a huge pool of evidence that social protection matters a lot for food security. So that's some initial thoughts. Thank you, Carlos.
No, thank you, Sarah. Very comprehensive, and I think very interesting also for our colleagues and our participants. Patrick, would you like to complement from the FAO side, on these questions, or elaborate a little bit on these points? Thank you.
Yeah, for sure, Carlos. Just to say that it was an unprecedented crisis, and as such, it was requiring a lot of evidence to ensure that we were designing the most appropriate response. And for FAO, it was translated into the quick setup of a comprehensive global data facility with our colleagues from WFP, with our colleagues and partner agencies from the Global Food Security Cluster, from our partners from the Global Network Against Food Crisis, to ensure that we were able to assemble a number of data on the not only on the impact of the COVID-19, but also on the needs which were triggered by the crisis. And this global data facility enabled FAO to develop a country dashboard, which were enabling a proper targeting of the intervention, and it was also enable FAO and partner to inform other food security monitoring mechanisms, such as the humanitarian need overview or the IPC, really enabling us to carefully monitor the impact of the crisis on the food security. This also, from an FAO perspective, really push for huge progress with regard remote data collection. And this also something which is characteristic from this COVID-19 response. It was shifting towards remote data collections to assess risk and needs, but also assess the final impact of the crisis and support scenario development. And ultimately, all this data being used to trigger anticipatory actions to prevent deterioration of food security. Because it was also a mean, using evidence was also a mean to prioritize interventions and better identify the type of interventions as well as the scale of the response which was needed in view of the evolving situations of food insecurity.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick. And I think very interesting to hear also some of the changes that organizations have to embark because of the impact of COVID-19. So it was also something that agencies like FAD, WFP had to change the way of working. I would like to open now the floor to colleagues that are following us. I think there has already been some questions on the chat. Maybe my colleague Sarah, you can help us reading out the questions and the comments.
Yes, so maybe we can start. We have an interesting comment from Emmanuel, who says, using evidence is constrained by the inability to collect evidence in an environment where restrictions to reach data sources, especially where direct interviews, administering of questionnaires are involved. I would just like to ask the panelists' opinion and also maybe their reflections about these constraints.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I don't know, Patrick, I mean, I see you wish to comment on that? Or Sarah?
Yeah, well, I can say something about that because one other thing I know WFP did a lot in this emergency. We've done it before, but it was more now, was the use of like remote data collection techniques. So mobile-based monitoring and questionnaires and surveys. I'm actually going to tell you something about it in a moment in my answer to your second question, so I won't give the story away now, but it's true, it is really challenging, but in a way it's a similar challenge as in you know, a context of conflict or any other situation where it becomes difficult sometimes to go and meet people face to face. So it's not as good as probably meeting people face to face, but it is proving to be a reliable and extremely useful way of getting information, and it's a good alternative in COVID.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Patrick, I think this is one of the lessons. No, learn also that it is possible to do this remote data collection. No, and let me maybe Patrick, you might want to comment more on that, also on the lessons.
Yeah, exactly, and in fact on the fact that this crisis have really boosted the IT side of data collections, and it has been really a massive scale up in terms of data collections to enhance our understanding of the context and be able to better articulate the interventions which was the most adequate for addressing the needs of the most vulnerable. We have seen that, for example, in Burkina Faso, in Madagascar, or in Timor-Leste, where through the use of mobile phone, we were able to have a relatively fine-tuned and detailed understanding of the situations and be able to design interventions which were, let's say, well targeted and well calibrated in a way.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. I think Johan, you wanted to say something on this topic?
No, I just okay. I think the constraint is very much evidenced in the context of indigenous peoples in terms of getting data in indigenous communities that are in remote areas. And we've seen, for example, that in some, like in Brazil, for example, where indigenous peoples are using their forest for their food production, but then illegal loggers came in, and it's difficult for them to mobilize others to support them so that they can continue to secure their food. But it's really a challenge. But like others have mentioned, the information technology that is at least growing now is addressing to some extent that gap. But I think it would be very important to ensure that data collection should also include those that are in remote areas and finding every whatever means that they can also provide data on their situation, so that appropriate action can also be done in relation to their food security.
No, thank you, Johan. A very good point, especially with indigenous groups that often don't speak the language of the country. No? So very difficult to reach.
Hello, Carlos, can I make a contribution? This is Emmanuel.
Yes, Emmanuel, please, but you want to put your camera so other people can see you? You can?
Sure, I'll do that, yeah. I'm actually the one who raised the issue about evidence, collecting evidence, how difficult it is. My name is Emmanuel. I'm based in Kenya. I work with the International Livestock Research Institute, and I'm actually talking from experience because Kenya is one of the countries in the East African region that has been hardly hit by COVID. And so my organization worked with a program that is supported by the USAID, wanted to assess the effect of COVID on the food systems and the program beneficiaries. But the challenge you had was, I'm raising this from the point where we say that using evidence, how evidence can be quite important for us to make decisions. But I was saying that even collecting this evidence is a big challenge, because if you can't access the areas, the data sources where to collect information to inform your evidence, then that's where the challenge is. And so what we did, there are various restrictions in terms of restriction in movement, because in areas where there are high cases of COVID, some countries put in place lockdowns, so people are not able to move from one place to another. And then in some cases, they put curfews, which are long hours of curfews. So that also adds to restriction in movement. And then there's also ignorance within the community on how COVID spreads. So in that case, they are always scared, afraid of people coming from outside their areas, because they know these guys are bringing in COVID. So in other words, collection of data directly through interviews and face-to-face discussions are not possible. So in our attempt to assess how COVID has had effect on the beneficiaries in terms of food systems and food distribution, we did arrange, do some kind of rapid assessment. But because that kind of physical contact was not possible, we used phone interviews. But even that one is not easy, because phone penetration is also not easy, because in some cases, not so many people have phones. And so if you have to only sample those who have phones, then it means you may be biased, because you may not collect information from all the people that are affected. So what we did, we used the local administrative structures and local volunteers, just some youth who are based within the community. We identified them, those who had phones, and then we did a random sampling of households, but you had these community-based volunteers whom we knew had phones. So in cases where a household that was sampled did not have a phone, then the volunteers helped us to access these households and then enabled us to collect information from these households. So we are able to get information. I may not say that we are not 100% effective, but at least we had a response rate of about 85% of the households that we had targeted. So I'm trying to explain some of the challenges that you encounter if you want to collect data during this period of COVID. And then based on that assessment, we're able to get some good information on the situation within the areas where we are targeting. And previous speakers have mentioned about various effects on COVID on food systems, on distribution, and others. But I haven't heard anybody talking about nutrition, and yet nutrition is one of the areas that have been hardly impacted, because in our assessment, we found out that households were, why? Because during this period, a lot of markets were closed. So farmers were not able to sell their produce. And then number two, even those who are depending on buying food from markets, because of markets, open markets were closed, so they could not access, they could not access food. So there was an effect in terms of quality and quantity of food consumed. So in terms of quality, we found out that most people now resorted to eating more of carbohydrates than protein-laden foods. Like most people now were eating rice or whatever carbohydrates laden foods, and then instead of proteins. And then in terms of quantity, there was high cases of people consuming less than 3 meals per day. Some of them, most of them actually were consuming 1 meal a day. And this has an effect on nutrition, because many of the people who are affected are children under 5 years, and in some cases, mothers of reproductive age. So those are some of the challenges I can share. I have more of this information that I could share, but not perhaps on this platform. I may not have time to do that. But those are some of the things I thought I would share with you in terms of having or collecting evidence to inform decision-making, especially during this period of COVID-19. Thank you.
No, thank you, Manuel, for sharing with us your experience with ILRI. Let me go back to our panelists for a second, because they have other points they want to share with you, but then we will also go back to the questions, because there are quite a few interesting questions also on the chat box. Let me maybe ask Sarah. Sarah wanted to share a bit more of information on the actions that WFP is taking to monitor the response. Sarah?
Thanks, Carlos. So we pass now to your second question about that. Okay.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, the second question, I think, yeah, it was just what's happening in terms of monitoring the food security impact of, well, I guess WFP's work, but also generally what's happening with monitoring the world's responses to COVID. And on that, on the first one, I would tell you that, as I mentioned in the first question, we have a number of channels that we use to track and monitor food security impact, things like emergency assessments or in-depth household surveys, surveys even that can be done through mobile means, spatial analyses, early warning information, and so on, as well as food security monitoring, of course. And something I would like to have shown you, but I don't think I can, but I'd encourage you to take a look if you're interested, is by the beginning of this year, actually 38 countries were collecting, using mobile technology, actually, almost real-time food security information that's updated weekly, and it's made publicly available. And this is on something called Hunger Map Live. You can take a look at it. It's really neat. There's a lot of good information. It gives, again, a weekly updated overview of the food security and nutrition situation, of the macroeconomic situation and food price inflation, of the prevalence of some key food security indicators like insufficient food consumption, and patterns and trends with that. And it has some data related to actually COVID-19 specifically, like people's access to health, as well as food-based coping strategies. So that's one means of monitoring that I thought it might be of interest to this group to highlight. And the second thing I just wanted to mention, which is not WFP doing it at all, but it's definitely relevant to highlight when we're talking about social protection, is that World Bank last year began an effort to track national social protection responses to COVID. And of course, they're using social protection there really as sort of an umbrella term for the whole range of responses that governments put in place to help people cope with, cope with the socioeconomic impact, economic impact primarily of the pandemic. And the World Bank's been tracking this now for a year. They did this every week or two, updating their compilation of what measures governments had put in place. And that tracker is now like a 650-page volume covering information on what 220 different countries have done and the 3,300 different social protection measures they've put in place. And that most of those measures, not all, but the majority of them are social assistance measures, including the kind of interventions that Patrick studied that Patrick was presenting to us earlier, like cash transfer programs and in-kind transfer programs and school feeding. But these are reaching, well over 1 billion people. So this is the scale, really, of the social protection response to COVID. And for an agency like WFP, and in fact, FAO and IFAD as well, that are concerned with food security kind of on an epic scale, what that meant is that we had to really start thinking about, not only how we were going to implement the response that we were implementing, but also how were we going to support those national responses in addition to what we were implementing ourselves. So I thought that might be an interesting thing to mention in the context of this discussion on tracking social protection responses.
Thank you very much, Sarah. In fact, remote data collection, remote monitoring, real-time monitoring is important for designing and for implementing good programs. Let me ask my colleague Wenxin. She has been looking at the question, the chat box, and there are some questions around this topic. Maybe Wenxin, you can help us with this.
Thank you, Carlos, panel members, for the interesting discussion. Here we will continue the conversation in Q&A section. Myself and Sarah Faber will monitor the chat box and read some questions has posted. Meanwhile, everyone, please feel free to raise your hand or post your question and comments in the chat box. Here we have a question from Yumiko. How do you balance the data collection requirement for overall planning and at local level to make the interventions tailored to specific contexts as much as possible, like what John mentioned in her previous speech? So maybe Sarah from WFP, you could briefly introduce some response to this question, or Patrick Jackson. Any of you, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if it's a matter of balancing it or just a matter of identifying very clearly what is the information that you need and then going out and getting it. Certainly, there's information that's needed for overall planning and local level information. And I guess one good approach would be to aggregate the global from the local.
Just to complement on that, I think we have to see that as an iterative process, because what we have been also implementing in this response, that we put in place very quickly a collection, a set of data to be collected to have quickly a first understanding of the impact in terms of food insecurity, the impact in terms of access to input, and we knew that it was going to be a long-standing crisis. And as the crisis is evolving, as the situation is evolving, then increasingly you complexify your set of data to fine-tune, adjust your response. And I think that's what we have to see, that you don't go immediately for a complete set of data extremely complex, but you fine-tune your analysis, your understanding of the crisis as per time evolved.
Yeah. Can I?
Please, John, please. Please go ahead, John, if you would like to comment.
Yes, Johan, please, the floor is yours. You wish to make a comment.
But if I may, I just want to respond also to the question on the what has been monitored, and maybe link it to this as well, because from my end, from the indigenous peoples groups, what we have monitored are two. One is the economic recovery plans of governments and other actors and its implications to food security and well-being of indigenous peoples. And the other one is the response of communities in building their resilience to the pandemic. So for the first one, on the response of governments for economic recovery, it is quite alarming, because a lot of the economic growth targets in response to the COVID is in relation to infrastructure, mining, agribusiness, tourism, and energy development. And many of the areas that are going to be used are areas of indigenous peoples, and a large chunk are also used for food production of indigenous peoples, or for example, forests are the source of food and livelihood for many communities that are being targeted for agribusiness, for example. So for us, this is going in the wrong direction in terms of making sure that there is strong policy coherence that supports sustainable food systems, particularly of indigenous peoples and small farmers, that also provides for food sustainability of food for all. So we need a policy coherence to protect this and against destruction, no? Because it will only worsen not only hunger, but also the existing inequality. So we need to be sure that these actions in response to COVID will also put the sustainability of food systems at the center of interventions, and ensuring that the rights and welfare of the food producers, the small farmers and indigenous peoples are at the center, because otherwise we will just continue like before and again compromise food security, and we cannot address goal 2 or end hunger if policy coherence in terms of our response to COVID is not undertaken. Now, in relation to community response, no, to this pandemic, in relation to food security, many communities were actually left on their own, especially those in remote areas. They did not get many kind of intervention. So many have relied in their own traditional system of food production. And one of the good value, I think, that everybody should reflect on is that indigenous peoples are very much into food production for sharing, the value of sharing. And so it ensures that you share your whatever you produce to people that have less, so everybody has something to eat. And that is the spirit that we need in this crisis. That is one. And then that food and the seeds, the ones that we produce, should remain as common good to be shared, so that everybody can also grow this food and be able to provide for themselves. And for the years of interaction of indigenous peoples in relation to their food systems, it's already now embedded with indigenous knowledge that they transfer to the next generation. But you can only do that as a matter of food sustainability, or if the productive sources are there, if the land's resources that you use for food production remains. So that means this need to be protected. And that's where I'm saying that we're worried that these lands and resources will be taken over for other purposes than food. And so we need to appreciate that for indigenous peoples, the value is also beyond just food, but also in relation to our culture, to our traditional knowledge, and ensuring intergenerational transfer and sustainability of food. And finally, just to mention that that for indigenous peoples, we need to look at the food systems not in isolation to our social cohesion or to our way of building cooperation and solidarity, because that is the one that is building community resilience in this kind of crisis or pandemic. So the values that indigenous peoples have in terms of the sharing of food, the upholding the common good, and taking care of those that have the least is something that should be embedded also in the way forward in recovering from this pandemic.
Johan, thank you very much for bringing up again this topic of solidarity and the importance of communities also to be resilient, no, to pandemics and to other shocks. No, let me ask my colleague Sarah Faber. She will. There are some questions on the chat box that are relevant and linked to the points you just raised. No? Maybe Sarah, please.
Yes, exactly. Linked to what Johan has just been saying. Now we have a question from Mark regarding COVID-19 movement restrictions, which have impacted the access consumers, but also food producers have to reach markets. What or how is social protection focusing on the production side to ensure that food can still move? Food seems to still be available and being produced, but how can we make sure it's being moved and accessed by consumers? Joan, Sarah, Patrick, maybe could you give us some insights?
Yes, Patrick, I think.
Maybe I can start. And I guess I will be complemented by Sarah, because I think it's typically the kind of joint work that FAO and WFP are doing together. So and I would say that from an FAO perspective, I would take it from an economic recovery perspective, ensuring that we are protecting the value chain, and we are ensuring that markets are functioning, ensuring that there is mean for the producer to bring their production to market. But then there is also a number of interventions which are securing that the production will be, and we have seen that in times of COVID, ensuring that there was some specific deal between local authorities and association of production to ensure that the food which was produced was then distributed by the most affected or to the most vulnerable. And that's also something on which we need to work to ensure that ultimately what is being produced, the food which is being produced, is being used as a means to address food insecurity, to reach the most vulnerable. Another example, and again, Sarah, I guess we complement it, it's the work being done with some school feeding program, with having some specific deals between local producer and ensuring that the food which was produced was appropriately distributed through the schemes which were replacing the school feeding program.
Can I quickly respond to that question on the how to support the farmers?
Yes, please, Jo.
Yeah, we have exactly, like I mentioned, the same situation in the Philippines, where the farmers their produce cannot reach the market because of the lockdown of transport, but also the market. So they appealed to local governments, and some local governments actually bought their produce, like tomatoes, vegetables, and gave them to those that do not have food. So it's a way, it's a subsidy basically. It's basically the principle of the cash transfer, but in a different way of supporting the local producers so that their products they can still sell by the government buying it from them, so that they still have that source of income, and at the same time the food were not wasted because they were given to families and that do not have food. So that's where this kind of intervention from government to support local farmers is very much needed, also as a form of social protection.
Can I say something?
Yes, please, Sarah.
Yeah, I really like Joanne's answer. I thought that was really a great example. I think I would just say, I think we have to be careful about not expecting social protection to solve all problems. So if farmers cannot reach markets because of access restrictions, that's a big problem, but it's not necessarily a social protection problem. You know, it becomes a social protection problem if farmers then need social assistance because of job losses, because they haven't managed to reach markets. So I think, you know, in terms of what we, you know, expect social protection to support, it's generally much more on the demand side than on the supply side, and specifically on access to food and stability. Of course, social protection can support you know, production as well, of course. But I think in the specific example that maybe Mark was asking about, I would just say that don't make everything a social protection problem.
Thank you, Sarah, for the clarification. Patrick, you have any final comments, or takeaway from this discussion that you may want to share? Because we're now going to start wrapping up this discussion. I think it has been very rich. I just wanted to give you this chance before we close.
No, thank you, Carlos. No, in terms of key takeaway, I would say, yeah, the response to this crisis was a challenge in terms of data management. And it was clear that it requested a strong strengthening of the way we were collecting data from a remote perspective, pushing or promoting innovative way of collecting data, and as such, and then it was also a response which was requiring a lot of effort in terms of scenario planning. So making a number of assumptions to very quickly be able to respond in the best manner. It was extremely important also to get this data right, to be able to very quickly promoting anticipatory action, and ensuring that we were also being able to adjust existing intervention on the ground. Then I would say, so ultimately all this data was also enabling us to get a comprehensive context analysis, which was critical to ensure the identification of the most accurate and the most impactful interventions. And ultimately, we just like to conclude that it was a crisis which show further the impact, the key role of local actors, and the necessity to engage with communities, and ensuring that local actors were in the primary role in responding to the crisis. That's it for me.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Maybe Sarah, what do you think? What is some takeaways, some final comments from your side on this discussion?
All right. Well, I think the first and probably most important one is social protection really matters a lot if you care about food security. And yes, you have poverty, vulnerability, food insecurity, nutrition, inequality. These things are tied together and bound up together, sometimes in very complex ways. But there was plenty of evidence already before COVID to know that social protection has most forms of social protection have a positive impact on food security most of the time. And because of that, there's a very strong rationale for any agency or person concerned about food security to be concerned about social protection. Now, that impact isn't as great as it could be if social protection were more explicitly designed with food security outcomes and nutrition outcomes in mind. And I think that we need to see more application of the evidence about social protection and food security translating into policy and practice in future. And I think the second big takeaway from all of this, huge experience that we've had over the last year and a half or so, COVID, no question was a very big shock, but it didn't occur on its own. And there is still the reality of sort of multiple compounding, overlapping shocks and vulnerabilities and stressors. In addition, all the chronic structural poverty that really social protection is actually designed to address. And all of these issues still are there, and they still need responses. So we have to be very careful, I think, about reallocating too much. We shouldn't reallocate all of our attention and all of our resources, globally, when I say we, to COVID in a way that deprioritizes some of these other important areas, because everything remains important. All the good work addressing structural poverty and food insecurity is important alongside what we're talking about now, addressing the acute situation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah, for those precisions and those takeaways. Johan, please.
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree also with what the others have mentioned. What I just want to add is that we also need to appreciate the value and contribution and their food producers, and the need to also protect them because of the role that they are playing and contributing for food security and sustainability for all. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Johan, and again, Sarah and Patrick, for your takeaway. So I think with this, I would like to conclude this session, and thank you very much for your comments, your questions. It was It was very rich. And let me pass now the stage to Renata, who wants to make a final announcement before we finish. Please, Renata.
Thanks to all participants for staying with us in these 90 minutes and a rich discussion, mixing also the perspective of big organizations and the perspective of local communities, which was very interesting. So thanks to all for this, for coming at the first EvalForward event for this week. I just want to say that we have other 3 events coming up tomorrow and on Thursday and Friday. So I would like to invite you to join us for other events. I will put on the chat the link to the EvalForward website, where you can find information for upcoming events for this gLOCAL week. Thank you all, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. All the best.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.